We underestimate the power of applause. One, clapping is good for heart muscles. So if you haven't gone for a walk, it can compensate. Second, when you'll be up here, you'll need the applause, so get your karmic balance up. Third, the government of India has not yet taxed clapping. They've taxed almost everything else that you can do. But on a serious note, Rachel, I'm glad your daughter is here. I wanted to bring my daughter, but tomorrow her 10th board's exam starts, which is really a big deal. And both my wife and everyone in the house is busy with that. It was fantastic listening to you. Uh, you talked about men being in the room. They are leaders, and rightly so. The session Breaking the Glass Ceiling has the same domain MD on it. Uh, I don't know, it's by design or but that's how it is. I shared it on my MDI group. I went to a business school called MDI, and one of my MDI juniors friends pointed it out. So we talked about men in the room. Luckily, you have enough women in the room and a decent number of men leaders in the room. Tell us, what is Lean doing to get more involved and kind of sensitize them and make them the ambassadors or leaders for Lean for what you stand and your organization stands?
Thank you for asking. And again, first of all, thank you for hosting too. This event is amazing. So thank you. It's lovely to see all of you. Yes, thank you. See, clapping.
It's our pleasure, and Sukirti and Uru, we collaborate with them very often, so
Yep.
it's very easy to collaborate.
It's amazing. So we're doing a number of things. We'd like to say that kind of we can get men through the heart, and I think a lot of men we can because they have daughters or they care deeply about equality. But a lot of it is why we do the research is that we think research is a very compelling way to get men on board and to really understand the business benefits of diversity. So that's why we do a lot of the research we do. And everyone in the room probably knows this, but if not, you should. And you should be using it when you talk about the value of diversity broadly and then gender diversity specifically. We know that diverse teams work harder than teams that are less diverse. We know that companies with more women in senior leadership have more employee-friendly policies and tend to outperform organizations that just have men in leadership. We know that diverse organizations tend to outperform those that are less diverse. And then we all know, and I alluded to this earlier, that we in the US and here have a huge young generation coming into the workforce with a different set of expectations. So in order to stay competitive, we need those young workers coming into the workforce to feel like that we're accommodating kind of their vision for what work should be. And that's a big conversation in the US, and I know that's a conversation that's being had here. The other thing when we talk to men, a couple things that we really like to do, which I've done here today, and I think for all the women in the room, we should do this, is we should make it explicitly clear that talking about gender diversity is not a men v. women conversation, that it's an everybody understanding the barriers women face and the biases women face and all working together. And I also want to point out that men are on the receiving end of gender bias as well. Right? So it is not just a woman's experience to struggle with biases. And then the other thing in terms of practical things, if you go to our site, leanin.org, we have practical recommendations for men and how they can lift their daughters up at home. We have practical recommendations for how you can be the most effective manager of women or kind of ally to women in the workplace. And then 50 Ways to Fight Bias was specifically developed to bring people of all genders to the table to talk about these issues and break it down into very specific examples of bias so that men really can understand kind of what it looks like and what it feels like. And one of the things we hear the most is that a table will come together. And again, this is no ding on men. But the table will come together and a man will read the card and go, this doesn't happen. And he'll look up and every woman at the table is going, yeah, it does. And so it is a good learning. So those are just a couple of the things that we're doing, but a lot of it I think starts with how are we communicating about gender bias and why it matters in a way that invites men into the conversation. The other thing I should say before I close on this topic is we also have to have a little empathy. It is hard when you're starting to talk about an issue that you don't understand or talk about an experience that you don't kind of, you haven't experienced yourselves. So nothing frustrates me more than in the US when a CEO who's a man puts his foot in it and says something that's particularly insensitive, or he really isn't understanding the experiences of women, and Twitter lights up just, really rageful, kind of really negative, because I do think we need to allow men to make mistakes while we're on this journey together. So I do think women coming to the conversation with a bit of empathy as well is very helpful.
Rachel, one thing, I watch a lot of movies, not a lot these days, but there was a time I used to watch a lot of, and one of the movies I remember I was preparing for today, we still have those stereotypes of men and women,
Yep.
because every man is like that. Every person is unique, forget man, woman. I watched this movie and I watched all the movies in this genre or this title. I watched Ocean's 8, and the Ocean's 8 has an all women cast. It does portray women in a certain way. It tries. Let's look at the positive. It tries to break the stereotype. If men can do it, so can women. I mean, I'm purely looking at it from a movie franchise standpoint. So, and you've been in India last 1 week. Tell us, in the US, there are lots of leaders, the Fortune 500 companies. When we take the BW 500, we are much lesser leaders. Tell us, what have been your top 3 learnings from your trip to India? How's India like the US, and how is India different than the US?
So I mentioned this a little earlier, but the one thing I've been struck by is I do think when women get into the workplace in India, a lot of the fundamentals are the same. But when you're more outnumbered and then you're more likely to be an only, obviously it's still a more profound experience, or kind of a more negative experience. Not to say that everything that happens in the workplace to women is negative at all, so I don't want anyone to hear that. So I think a lot of the fundamentals are the same, but the biases are a bit stronger because we have a little bit more, I think, here in India to do as a culture. It's a little bit more of a patriarchal culture than it is in the US, for example. So that's one thing I've been struck by. But what I have most been struck by is women telling stories about what's happening at home. We know this from all the research we've ever seen, that there's such a strong connection between what's happening at home and how much support you're getting at home and how much work you're doing at home and what's happening at work. It's hard to be your best self at work if you're not getting supported at home. So what I've been most struck by is, this concept of 50-50 in the home, I think, is very elusive no matter where in the world you are.
It is.
It
is. I can say I am almost zero. And all of it is my wife. That's why I can be who I want to be. And, so I really say it that, women have a lot more to do, and most women will never sacrifice their role of being a mother to being a CEO, so they got to do both with aplomb, to put it mildly,
Right. And so, I mean, the counter to that, it's just, and we're all having different experiences in different cultures, but the counter to that is when people ask me how I'm able to do what I do, it's because I do have 50-50 at home.
You're lucky.
Right, and I'm lucky. And so the one thing I've most been struck by is women just not getting the support at home that they need. That's a very complicated cultural issue, but one that I know is being discussed here in India and needs to be continued to be discussed. And the one thing I was so struck by, I got asked a question and I really didn't have a good answer. So I got asked a question by a leader who's a man at a corporate, and he said, what can we as organizations do to change what's happening at home? And I thought about that for a second, because in the US, what we would typically say is nothing. The organization's kind of purview ends at the 4 walls of the organization. Not to say that paid family leave isn't critical, not to say that support as women are offboarding on leave or coming back in leave, that they're getting additional support. Childcare is critical. It's not that organizations can't be doing something to help women and all of us.
Flexi hours.
Flex hours. There's things
Work from home.
Exactly. There's a lot of things organizations can be doing, but one of the things he shared that had me jaw dropped, because it would just never happen in the US, is that he was saying that some organizations are inviting whole families into events to show the amazing work the women are doing. And so they understand what's happening in the workplace.
What the lady is doing is valuable, and
yes,
it's making a difference.
Exactly. And so I was struck by that because I think it just points
Simple.
to some amazing creativity that organizations are doing that, but it also points to how sharp the differences are, that you would never think to do that or that you needed to do that in the U.S. I think fundamentally people know that the work women are doing in the workplace is important and it matters. And then of course in the U.S. so many couples do not have a choice. They need to be dual career couples.
But you must be really powerful. Donald Trump got to know you're coming to India, he decided to follow you. I'm not sure you're proud of that. And Tanvi, who's our marketing head, I still like her in spite of her sharing her birthday with Donald Trump, but that's another story. You have a very interesting podcast, and I tried to listen to it for a while. It's called Tilted. And the counterpoint to that would be balance, which is what Lean In is about. Tell us a little bit about Tilted and tell us about some stories from there.
Sure. So the idea with Tilted, last season was our first season. I hosted. It's been a really great personal adventure. I mean, you're in media. It's my kind of first kind of dipping a little toe into the media space. It's been humbling to do. But the idea with Tilted is to help us address issues as an organization that we're not able to address programmatically. We're not going to have a big program against it, but we think it matters. So a couple episodes we did last year that that really resonated with me. So one was bias, gender bias, but all types of bias in artificial intelligence, and how we are baking bias into AI and therefore perpetuating and even exacerbating bias. One was on bias in healthcare. So as many of you probably know, most healthcare research historically has been done using men, and so we often as women aren't getting the same level of healthcare. This year, I'm really excited. We did an episode, it's not out yet, but on boys. As you talked about earlier, what are the messages we're sending our boys where they need to feel like they need to keep a lot of kind of feelings internally? This idea of bro culture, there's a lot of different terms for it, where they real machismo, they feel like they need to act a certain way and never show weakness, always show strength, which is back to some of the biases we talked about earlier. It's just the other side of the bias. And this year, one that I'm really interested and really excited about is we talked to Jill Soloway, who is the producer of the show Transparent. And the show, as you probably know, is about a parent who is transgender. And we talked to an amazing advocate in the U.S. named Jacob Tobiah. And they are non-gender conforming. And talked to them about their place in the movement. And the movement for equality, and when you're non-binary, what does that mean when we talk about gender and gender stereotypes? So it's really interesting. So the idea with the podcast, as I said, is to go out and talk about issues that we think are deeply important or matter, but we don't always address as much in our day-to-day.
And also inspiring.
Yes, and this year we're really committed to the end of every episode, or woven through the episode is things that you can hopefully do in your practical life. So on the boys episode, really practical tips for how we can raise our boys to be their full selves. Even in the episode on gender non-conforming individuals, there's some recommendations for how we should support those that are non-binary and what that looks like, and what and some of the language we can use or should or shouldn't use. So very practical tips as we're all kind of on this journey towards equality and all types of equality. So thank you for asking, because it's really a passion project of mine.
Being in the media, and I'm being honest, I've never distinguished between a man and a woman. It's not come to my mind. I just want to exchange for media, which I started from scratch. Out of my 6 editors, 5 are women. Out of my 6 business heads, 4 are women. Right? So really, maybe it's because of the nature of the work we are in. And some of them we worked with me. My editors worked with me 16 years. My head of South has worked with me 10 years. My editor of my weekly Impact, which is broadly like the ad age of India, has worked with me 10 years. So we've never. I've honestly, and I grew up to a very strong mother. My sister was more brilliant. Older sister was more brilliant at studies than me. So I was good, but she was so good that I had always had pressure. My wife went to a top-notch business school like me. She works, she's an entrepreneur. And dare I say, in some families, I can't speak for every family, but really, I may say it jokingly that really my wife is the boss, but really in some way she's the pivot, if I may not, let me use she's the center. We kind of as a family, she's the center of the family for the kids, for me. While I may have my role as an entrepreneur, but when it comes to kids, there are some things that I do. For example, I insisted that we enroll my daughter, who was 15 at that point last year. She's almost 16 now, to the TIE, the Indus Young Entrepreneur of the Year, and she came second in the business plan in a group of 5.
Amazing.
Yeah, it did a lot to her confidence. But we made sure our son was there, who's younger, who's almost as old as your daughter. He's in class 7 and he's 12. Almost 12, he's not yet 12. So really, I think for a lot of, because my mother used to work, she's very strong, my father's a gentleman. So, a lot of those things really didn't, because, I was talking to Urvi about preparing questions for you, and I told her that the simple thing is that we've grown up in so much patriarchy as a society. I'm not necessarily talking about myself, that some of the things that we should do naturally don't happen because we think in a very different way. I'm talking generally, I'm not talking of any individual in this room. So I want to ask you my last question and bring 2-3 questions from the audience. See, the role of media is also very, very important, Rachel. And we see it as discovering new women entrepreneurs. Last week we did a Women Entrepreneurship Summit, and we discovered at least 20 new leaders. Poonam is there, Ms. Barwa is there. She runs her own forum. There are at least 10 other forums like that. I mean, not exactly like that. Each one has their strengths and uniquenesses. Every forum is unique, but everyone is contributing. When do you think there'll be no need for lean in? Is in 5 years, in 10 years, where we don't have to sensitize people to say, we need to draw. Do you think there'll be a day in the US first and some day in India when we don't really need a lean in?
So I do this work because I darn well believe that there is going to be a day, probably different. It's going to be different time frames in different parts of the world, depending on what the headwinds are that women face and kind of what the culture is. But I absolutely do this work believing that we are going to get to 50-50. It is not going to happen anytime soon. Even in the U.S., where I think I know we're further along on the journey. I look at the data every year from our own Women in the Workplace study, and those numbers, they're moving, but gosh, are they moving slowly. So change is hard, change takes a lot of work, but I do believe that we are going to get there. And it is going to be amazing to think about kids of all genders, wherever they fit on the gender continuum, growing up and just feeling free to be their whole selves and pursue whatever it is they'd like, whether that's leaning in at home or that's leaning into the workplace. But I do believe we'll get there, but not in my lifetime. Hopefully in my daughter's lifetime. Yeah. And I will tell you at Lean In, we're committed to continuing to do the work until we get there. And that means all women everywhere in the world. So I don't know who I'll be handing the baton off to, but we're going to be doing this work for quite a while.
Yeah. I want to ask you a follow-up question. When you talk of mentors, is there any research or some study or some kind of data or anecdotes which showcases what is the impact on a young woman leader if the mentor is male and vice versa when the mentor is female?
Right. So the research that I've seen, and even anecdotally, I don't think there's a fundamental difference in the quality of the mentorship. I mean, there's some advantages to being a woman mentoring a woman because you have a better sense of shared experiences, but there's also huge benefits to men mentoring. The one biggest difference is that since men tend to be more senior on average, and men hold more power in organizations. Mentorship is so important, but sponsorship is what really starts to move the dial. And men are in a position where they're able to often be better sponsors because since they're more senior, they can open up more doors. So think about it. I mean, if you're mentoring someone, I want you as a mentor because you're quite senior and you can create opportunities for me and open up doors for me. And so, but I do want to say also, we know from research that sponsorship is quite rare. Like in the U.S., men and women are not getting enough sponsorship. So although women critically need it, everybody needs it. So I think that's a good reminder to all of us, particularly those people in the room who are more senior, that sponsorship matters for everyone, and there's just a lack of it across the board.
You know, Haley is here, and let's bring it. Would Haley now want to be more successful? Has her perspectives changed? I think she's traveled with you last 1 week. I'm sure even without travel, she knows the impact that you make and how your work is really important. But Haley, would you want to be more successful now? Would you like to revisit your answer that you gave to your mommy? Okay, that's good enough. That's good enough. Your smile gives it away.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we can take 2 questions and keep to our time. Please make your questions Twitter-like. Yes, the lady there. Tell us who you are, where do you work, and if you have a Swiss account number, you can give that to me privately. I'm sure you're a loud Punjabi. Aanchal didn't need a mic. You're a loud. You're at least sitting in front of a Punjabi who's a friend of mine, so I can.
I think I'll need to use the mic, so if I may.
I can't see.
Yeah. So my name is Sunita Thawani. I'm a lawyer by profession. And I worked with Tata Group for 25 years. And now, I have been following gender issues for last 2 decades as my passion. And now for last 6 years, I'm intensely working in the area of prevention of sexual harassment at workplaces. Now, listening to the discussion and the solutions, it was wonderful, to how to respond to
What's your question, ma'am?
I'm just coming to that. So during my workshops, what I have seen is, and the solution that you said, that, bring people to the table and let them talk to each other. So this particular law is all about, not about intention, but impact. And that is what, when I see that when people come to the table and you facilitate that interaction, that what you say and what you think is normal, it has a very severe impact on the person who is receiving it, all these biased comments. So my question was that, in India, now we have a law, which is Prevention of Sexual Harassment Act 2013, which has this particular gender sensitization and awareness on sexual harassment, what the definition is, a mandatory compliance issue for all the organizations across the country with more than 10 employees. So it's a huge opportunity to sensitize people. I want to know whether in US, when we are doing away with arbitration agreements and confidentiality agreements, is there any push on making gender sensitization compulsory across? Thank you.
That's a great question. Obviously, when we talk about fundamentals, like we talk about equal pay, we talk about paid family leave, no one, regardless of their gender, should be harassed in the workplace, hard stop. So, like you, we obviously have laws against sexual harassment, very clear definitions of what sexual harassment is and isn't. I think that, we're seeing less forced arbitration. That's been a big issue, obviously, even with the presidential race, and I think we still have a long way to go there. But rather than getting into the specific laws, I think the fundamentals we kind of mostly agree with, which is women should be protected under the law, and then women need a voice both within their organization when they claim sexual harassment. That needs to be treated thoughtfully, quickly, decisively, and then women need, as many safeguards and as many pathways, from a legal perspective to make sure that they're being heard and that sexual harassment is being addressed.
But the point is that the sexual harassment, all these biased comments, the gender-based comments also fall under the definition of sexual harassment.
From what I know in the U.S., some microaggressions, some biased comments do when they're about, they're more sexual in nature, they're more physical in nature, and many don't. But if the question you're asking is, sexual harassment is the most, is incredibly sinister, has to stop. But yes, microaggressions and and sexual, discrimination are all part of the larger issue, which is that women are not often having as safe and respectful experiences in the workplace as
So,
possible. So I do think addressing that makes sense and is actually part of that larger conversation. If that
Rachel, what
answers
she's,
your question.
words matter in journal, now I'm a little, at a stage in life, but I've learned in the last 10 years that most conflicts about what you say, how you say, in journal. And as a man, I'm today with my daughter as a teenager, she's like a young adult. I'm more sensitive. 8 years back, 6 years back, I would crack jokes that I wouldn't think, and everybody, women would laugh equally, if not more, on those jokes. I stopped cracking those because I think they can be offensive to one person in the room or two. So I think men, in what she's saying is in the terminology that men use,
Yeah.
because you have to be a little different when you have women around you. And I would I say, we have to change the way we think, because otherwise subconsciously what you say to a male friend will also come out when you're with a female friend, right? So I think that's what she's referring to, what you say to a colleague at work, how do you say it. I think there is a need for workshops on that, and there are, I think the terminology men use when they engage with women colleagues or generally the stakeholders that they do business with needs to change. I think, is that what you're referring to? Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. 50 Ways to Fight Bias actually addresses a lot of the things that are that are adjacent to sexual harassment and even directly address sexual harassment. And the other thing I would say, just that it's a good reminder to everybody, we should still be able to be collegial in the workplace, but you need to remember who's holding the power. So, if you're a coworker and you give someone a high five or give them a little hug, that may be okay. If you're a man and you're the boss, and you give, a hug, that is a totally different ball of wax. So
Sure.
I do think the awareness, too, of kind of who's holding the power in the room and how that person is behaving, I think people need to be acutely aware of that. And I love hearing that you're kind of on the journey and adjusting the way you show up in the workplace yourself.
I'm definitely more sensitized. I could need more sensitization, but we'll end. I think we're out of time.
We'll send you a deck of cards. I'm
Yes,
teasing you.
why not? I'll go to your site and read them. And I really mean it. I think every time I go out, I learn something new. So I just want to end by saying to all the women in this room, don't forget you can. You can start late. You can start over. You can be unsure. You can act different than men. You can try and fail, but you will all succeed. Thank you, and please give Rachel a big round of applause. Thank you for coming and increasing the consciousness around women leadership and inclusion of women in the workplace. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you very much.
It's a great contribution, and I'm sure you'll do it with aplomb
Great.
as you
And
go
thank you
forward.
for your leadership.
Thank you so much.